The wind on that ridge did not blow the way wind blows in other places. It did not gust and rest. It pushed steady for hours at a time, as if the land itself had been assigned to keep every living thing away from it. Sarah Whitcomb knelt in the gray dust of that ridge with a seedling no thicker than her smallest finger, and she held it the way a person holds something they already suspect they will lose. She was 26 years old, 6 months a widow. The paper in the county office called this ground hers now, though nobody in the valley believed she had gained anything at all. The land had passed through 3 families before her, and each of them had walked away from it, not sold it, walked away from it. The way people walk away from a debt they can no longer pretend to pay. There was a fence at the edge of that ridge that nobody had mended in years. It did not keep animals in. It did not keep animals out. It simply marked where one kind of failure ended and another kind of failure began. The seedling went into ground. Sarah packed the dry soil around its thin roots with both hands, and for a moment, in the lull between gusts, it stood upright on its own. Then the wind came back. By the time she reached the second row, 3 of the first 6 trees were already leaning sideways, as if bowing to something none of them could see coming. A neighbor watched from his wagon on the road below, and he did not stop to help. He had good reason not to. He had tried grass on that ridge once, years earlier, and the grass had not survived a single season. What Sarah was attempting, on paper, made no sense. Trees needed water this ridge did not hold. They needed shelter this ridge had never offered anyone. And they needed years, more years than most people were willing to spend waiting on ground that had already disappointed everyone who touched it. But Sarah had spent 3 weeks doing something none of her neighbors had done. She had not looked at the ridge and seen wasted land. She had walked it slowly at different hours, in different weather, and she had started to notice things the others had stopped noticing generations ago. The wind did not blow the same way across the whole ridge. And if that was true, then perhaps the ridge was not one failure. Perhaps it was several small ones, sitting side by side, waiting for someone patient enough to tell them apart. If you are watching this from a place where the wind still shapes how people live, tell us where you are. Stories like this one survive because people still care enough to remember them. And if frontier wisdom like Sarah still matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. To understand why the whole valley considered Sarah Whitcomb's decision foolish, a person had to understand what that ridge had already taken from 3 families before her. The first family had cleared it for wheat, back when the soil still held a thin layer of good earth on top of the clay beneath. 2 dry seasons in a row had stripped that layer away, blown it eastward in brown clouds that settled on porches a full day's ride from where it started. The second family had tried grazing sheep on it, hoping the animals needed less than crops did. The sheep had needed water the ridge could not hold, and grass the wind would not allow to establish itself. The third family had simply built a small cabin near the base of the slope and used the upper ground for nothing at all, as if naming it useless made the naming permanent. By the time Sarah's husband, Thomas, had won the land in a debt settlement 2 years before his death, most people in the valley had stopped thinking of it as land at all. They thought of it the way a person thinks of a debt too old to collect, something that existed on paper and nowhere else. Thomas had never lived to do anything with it. A fever had taken him during a hard spring, the kind of spring that took more than one man in that country, and Sarah had been left with a small house near the town road, 2 milking cows, and a ridge that everyone agreed was worth exactly nothing. She could have sold it. A land agent from a county seat had ridden out twice that autumn to offer her a price, so low it amounted to an insult dressed as generosity. Sarah had refused both times, not out of pride, but because she had begun, quietly, to walk the ridge in the evenings after her chores were finished. She noticed that the wind did not touch every part of it equally. Near the base of the slope, where an old outcrop of stone broke the open ground, the grass grew a little longer before it browned. Higher up, where the wind had a clear run at the land with nothing to slow it. Even the toughest weeds struggled to hold their ground for more than a season. She noticed, too, that after a hard rain, water did not simply vanish into clay the way everyone assumed. It gathered briefly in certain low folds of the ridge before it either sank in or ran off. Nobody else had watched closely enough or patiently enough to see where. Her neighbor, a rancher named Elijah Voss, who had worked that stretch of country for over 30 years, put it plainly enough one afternoon when he saw her out walking the slope again. He told her the ridge had already broken 3 families more capable than she was, and that watching where water sat for an hour after a storm would not change what the ground was. He was not being cruel. He had genuine reason to believe what he said. He had seen good farmers fail on that exact ground, men with more money, more hands, and more experience than a young widow working alone. His doubt was not foolishness. It was the accumulated memory of a place that had disappointed everyone who had tried it. But Sarah had noticed something Elijah had not considered, because he had never needed to look that closely at ground he had already given up on. The ridge was not uniform. It only looked that way from the road. By the time the first frost came that year, Sarah had made a decision that she did not share with anyone in the valley until she had already begun. She was going to plant trees, not a small windbreak near the house, the kind any sensible farmer might consider. Hundreds of them, across the upper and middle sections of the ridge, in a pattern she had worked out from her evening walks rather than from any book or any neighbor's advice. When she finally mentioned it to Elijah over the fence that separated her land from his, he did not laugh at her the way people in town later claimed he had. He simply asked her, with the patience of a man who had buried more failed plans than he could count, where she intended to find the water for even a tenth of that number. It was a fair question. The ridge had no stream, no spring that anyone had located, and a well at the base of the slope that ran low by midsummer most years. Trees, unlike wheat or grass, could not simply be planted and abandoned to the season. They needed years of attention before they could survive on their own, if they survived at all. Sarah did not have an answer that satisfied him that day. What she had was an observation and a stubbornness that the valley would later remember more clearly than it remembered the observation itself. She had noticed that snow did not melt evenly across the ridge either. In certain folds and hollows, drifts lingered for weeks after the open ground had gone bare, releasing their water slowly into the soil beneath them rather than all at once. She believed, though she could not yet prove it, that if trees were placed to take advantage of those same folds, and if their roots could survive the first 2 or 3 difficult years, the ground itself might begin to hold more moisture than anyone assumed it could. It was not a plan built on faith. It was a plan built on paying closer attention to a piece of land than anyone before her had bothered to pay. Word of her intention spread through the valley faster than the actual planting did. A young widow, alone, attempting something with borrowed seedlings in her own 2 hands that 3 established families had failed to accomplish with far more resources. By the time the first neighbors rode past to see for themselves, they were not expecting to witness anything but a longer, slower version of the same failure the ridge had always produced. Sarah began in early spring, working alone to the cold mornings before her other chores demanded her attention. She had traded a portion of her small savings, along with 2 days of labor helping a neighboring family with their own planting, for enough young seedlings to begin the lowest rows. She placed the first trees not in straight lines, the way a person might plant for the sake of appearance, but in a pattern that followed the low folds she had marked the previous autumn. It looked, to anyone watching from the road, like an odd and inefficient way to use the ground. It looked, in other words, exactly like the kind of decision the ridge had punished before. Doubt did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way most doubt does in a small valley, in small pieces, carried between neighbors who meant no particular harm by repeating what they had seen. A woman from town, delivering eggs along the road one morning, mentioned to Sarah that her brother-in-law had said the trees would not last the summer. She did not say it unkindly. She said the way a person passes along a weather report, something true enough not to argue with. Elijah Voss, for his part, never mocked her outright. He had too much respect for hard work to do that. Even work he believed was misplaced. But he did stop by twice that spring to point out, gently, that two of her seedlings near the upper slope had already begun to yellow, their thin trunks bending further with each strong wind than a healthy tree should bend. Sarah did not argue with him. She walked out to look at the yellowing trees herself, and what she found unsettled her more than his warning had. The soil around their roots had dried faster than the soil lower on the slope. Even though she had chosen that spot for its proximity to one of the snow hollows she had mapped the previous autumn, she had assumed the hollow alone would be enough. She was beginning to understand that assumption and observation were not the same thing. That same week, a hard spring wind stripped the leaves from 4 young trees near the ridge's exposed western edge, the section with the least natural shelter from the outcrop of stone below. By the following morning, all 4 had toppled sideways, their shallow roots unable to hold against ground that had never developed enough structure to anchor anything larger than grass. Word of the fallen trees reached town before Sarah had even finished clearing them away. It was, for many in the valley, exactly the confirmation they had expected. The ridge had claimed another attempt, and this one, at least, had been quicker to fail than the others. Sarah spent that evening sitting on the porch of her small house, looking up toward the ridge in the fading light, and she allowed herself, for perhaps the first time since Thomas's death, to consider that everyone else might simply be right, that she had mistaken a young widow's stubbornness for insight, and that the ground she had inherited was exactly what 3 families before her had already proven it to be. But sitting with that doubt, she found herself returning again to the details rather than the conclusion. The trees that had failed were not scattered randomly across her planting. They shared something in common. Every one of them stood in a spot fully exposed to the western wind, with no rise of ground, no outcrop, and no distance from the ridge's harshest edge to soften what reached them. The trees near the stone outcrop, the one she had placed almost as an afterthought while working out her pattern the previous autumn, had not yellowed. They had not lost a single leaf. It was not proof that her larger plan would succeed. It was something smaller and, in its way, more useful. It was a boundary, a line she could now draw between where the ridge might eventually allow something to grow and where it plainly would not, no matter how much patience anyone brought to it. What Sarah did next was not the work most people in the valley associated with farming. For nearly 2 weeks that spring, she planted almost nothing at all. Instead, she walked the ridge each morning with a notebook that had belonged to Thomas. Its first page is still filled with his handwriting from another purpose entirely, and she began recording what she found in the blank pages that remained. Where frost lingered longest on a cold morning, where the wind seemed to slow, even slightly, as it crossed a rise or dipped into a hollow, where the ground, when she pressed her palm flat against it after rainfall, held a trace of dampness longer than the soil beside it. She was not inventing a method. She was doing, more carefully and more patiently than anyone before her had bothered to do, something any experienced farmer might have recognized as simple observation. The difference was that nobody with experience had considered the ridge worth that much attention in the first place. By comparing her notes against the pattern of her failed trees, she began to understand something the ridge had been telling her from the start, in a language she had not yet learned to read closely enough. The stone outcrop near the base of the slope did more than mark a boundary on a map. It broke the wind's path just enough to create a narrow band of calmer air behind it, a band that widened slightly as it climbed the slope before the wind reasserted itself higher up. Her original planning had followed the snow hollows alone, trusting that moisture was the only variable that mattered. She now understood that moisture without shelter was not enough. A young tree needed both, and needed them in the right combination, or would either drown in standing water. It could not use or be stripped bare by wind before its roots had grown strong enough to anchor it. She began to mark a new pattern, one that traced a calmer band of air downwind of the outcrop, rather than following the snow hollows in isolation. It meant abandoning some of her original planting sites and accepting that a portion of her first season's work would need to be replaced rather than expanded. Elijah, watching her mark stakes in the ground along this new pattern one afternoon, asked what had changed. Sarah told him plainly that she had been planning for water and forgetting about wind, and that the ridge did not forgive a person for solving only half a problem. He did not offer encouragement that day, but he did not offer further warning either. He simply nodded, the way a man nods at an explanation that, for the first time, sounds like it might actually hold together. The true test came not from Sarah's planning, but from whether she could not control, and had not fully anticipated. In early summer, a storm rolled down from the higher country to the north, the kind of storm the valley saw perhaps once every 2 or 3 years, carrying wind strong enough to strip shingles from roofs and rain heavy enough to cut new channels through dry ground in a single afternoon. It arrived with little warning, the sky darkening faster than the harvest crews working the valley floor could react to. Sarah spent the worst of it inside her house, listening to the wind test every loose board on the porch, and thinking more than once of the young trees on the ridge that had barely survived one difficult season, let alone a storm like this one. When she walked up the slope the following morning, she expected the worst. What she found instead surprised even her. The trees planted along her newer pattern, sheltered by the calmer band of air behind the stone outcrop, had bent under the wind but had not fallen. Their leaves were torn and scattered across the ground around them, but their trunks remained upright, their roots still gripping soil that held together where the surrounding ground had washed into shallow gullies. The older planting, the trees she had placed along the exposed western edge before she fully understood the wind's path, had not fared as well. 2 more had fallen, and a third leaned. So far it would not likely recover. It was not a complete victory. It was, instead, exactly the kind of partial proof that mattered most. The storm had not simply spared her efforts by chance. It had spared the trees planted according to what she had learned, and claimed the trees planted according to what she had merely guessed. Elijah rode up that same morning, expecting, by his own later account, to find confirmation of everything he had warned her about. Instead, he found Sarah standing among trees that should not have survived a storm of that size on ground that had never held anything living through worse weather. He did not say much. He examined the stone outcrop, the pattern of the surviving trees, and the shallow gullies cut through the unsheltered ground nearby, and he allowed, for the first time, that whatever Sarah had noticed about that slope might be worth paying closer attention to. It was a small moment. It changed nothing about the years of work still ahead of her, but it was the first time anyone in the valley besides Sarah herself had looked at that ridge and seen the beginning of an answer instead of the confirmation of a failure. The storm that summer was not the true test. It was only the rehearsal for one. The following year brought a drought that settled over the valley in early spring and did not lift until well into autumn, the kind of dry season older residents compared, without exaggeration, to the worst they could remember from their own childhoods. Wells that had never failed before ran low. Established farms with decades of proven soil began losing crops that had never failed them in living memory. For Sarah's young trees, most no older than 2 seasons, it was the kind of test that could undo everything her patient observation had built. Roots that had barely begun to reach deeper soil now faced months without meaningful rain, in ground that had never been generous with water even in ordinary years. She spent that summer hauling water by hand from the well at the base of the slope, up a grade steep enough to make the work punishing even for someone accustomed to hard labor. She rationed it carefully, favoring the newer trees over the older ones that had already shown some capacity to hold their own, and favoring the sheltered rows behind the outcrop over the few she had not yet been able to relocate from the exposed western edge. It was during this drought that Elijah began, without being asked, to help carry water some mornings before his own work demanded his attention. He never called it help outright. He referred to it only as checking on the ridge, as though his presence there was simple curiosity rather than labor freely given to a project he had once doubted outright. Other neighbors began to notice as well, though few said so directly. A ridge that had swallowed 3 families whole was somehow still green in patches. In a year when far better land elsewhere in the valley had turned the color of dust, the drought did not spare Sarah entirely. She lost a number of trees that year, mostly younger ones planted in soil that had not yet developed enough structure to hold moisture through a season this severe. But the losses were scattered rather than total, and the pattern of what survived continued to trace the same line she had first marked out after her early failures, the sheltered band behind the stone, where wind lost some of its force, and where moisture, however scarce, lingered longer than it did elsewhere. By the time the rains finally returned in early autumn, Sarah had spent the better part of 2 years learning, tree by tree and season by season, exactly which part of that ridge were willing to support something living, and which parts, despite every hope, simply were not. It took nearly 10 years for the ridge to become what it eventually became, and no single season marked the turning point. It arrived instead the way most real change arrives on a working piece of land, through the slow accumulation of ordinary seasons, each one slightly less difficult than the one before it. By the 5th year, the trees behind the stone outcrop had grown tall enough to shelter the ground beneath them, softening the wind for the rows planted just beyond their reach. What had once been a narrow, sheltered band had begun, gradually, to expand its own boundaries, exactly as Sarah had hoped it eventually might. By the 8th year, grass had returned to sections of the ridge that had not held grass in living memory, not because anyone had planted it deliberately, but because the trees had done, slowly and without ceremony, exactly what Sarah had first suspected they might. They had given the wind fewer places to strip the ground bare, and they had given rain and snowmelt more time to sink into soil instead of running off it. By the 10th year, the ridge that the valley had once considered a debt too old to collect had become something else entirely. Its shaded slopes ran several degrees cooler on hot summer afternoons than the open farmland below. Its soil, once thin and quick to blow away, had thickened with a decade of fallen leaves breaking slowly down into the ground. Families who had once ridden past that fence without a second glance began asking, at first quietly and then openly, whether Sarah might be willing to sell a portion of it, or teach them how she had done what she had done. Elijah Voss, by then an old man, was often the one who answered those questions on her behalf when she was too occupied with the work itself to entertain them. He would tell anyone who asked that Sarah had not beaten that ridge by wanting it more than the families before her had. She had beaten it by watching it more closely than any of them ever had, and by being willing to admit more than once that her first understanding of the land had been incomplete. No one in the valley mentioned by then the jokes that had circulated about her a decade earlier. They only stood at the edge of her tree line on quiet afternoons, hats in hand, looking at shade that had not existed on that slope within any of their lifetimes. Sarah Whitcomb never became a wealthy woman from that ridge. She never intended to. What she gained instead was harder to put a price on, and in its own way, more permanent. She gained ground that no longer needed defending, in a valley where every other family still measured their land against seasons that could turn against them without warning. She gained a small measure of authority, the kind earned only through years of visible, patient work that allowed her opinion on planting, drainage, and shelter to carry real weight among neighbors who had once dismissed her entirely. And she gained something else, something the county records and the later stories about her never fully captured. She gained proof, standing quietly on a slope that 3 families before her had abandoned, that watching a piece of ground closely enough, for long enough, could reveal answers that no amount of doubt, however reasonable, could have predicted in advance. Local accounts from later decades describe families moving to that section of the valley specifically for the shelter and soil that ridge eventually offered, land that had once been given away for almost nothing now sought after by people who had never known its earlier reputation at all. The exact details of those later years were never fully recorded, the way most quiet, decades-long successes rarely are. What can be said with confidence is that the ridge that had broken 3 families before Sarah Whitcomb never broke her, and that the trees she planted one uncertain row at a time are still remembered by the families who eventually chose to live in their shade. The ridge had never been about proving the neighbors wrong. It had been about giving the wind fewer places left to take from the ground. And 10 years later, what was left behind was not an argument one, but a home that had simply, patiently outlasted everyone's doubt. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.